Aromatic rings are especially rigid and especially stable, and those make them really attractive to biological. They make them very biologically active molecules. The fact that they're very rigid means they'll fit very reliably into receptor sites, and the fact that they're very stable means that they can travel from one place to another in an organism without reacting with anything or changing. So, oftentimes when you first see the structure for a molecule, you'd want to look for where you have aromatic rings. A lot of biologically active molecules have these aromatic rings. And when you see where you see those, that's probably the part of the molecule that is fitting into a receptor site. So you don't want to change that too much. You could change little things, maybe replace a hydrogen with a fluorine. They're about the same size. Maybe, you can make little changes, but even those little changes sometimes completely disrupt the effect of the medication. So usually you don't want to change the rigid part of a molecule too much. What you can usually change is the floppy part of the molecule, the part of the molecule that has just single bonds that rotate all the time and that spin around like a soft piece of spaghetti in boiling water. Those you can change, and you can make them either more polar so that the patient will pee out the molecule more easily. So if the drug is having too high of a toxicity, you can take the part of the molecule that has a lot of single bonds and put a lot of polar groups on it, and it'll be really water soluble and the patient will pee it out. Or you can make it really non-polar, then it'll have an easier time of getting into fatty tissues or moving through fatty tissues. For example, all of the arteries in your brain are surrounded by a sort of fatty layer. It's called the blood-brain barrier, and it prevents polar molecules in your blood from getting into your cerebrospinal fluid. So if the molecule is too polar, it won't get into your cerebrospinal fluid, but if the drug needs to get there, then you can use these floppy side chains, make those really nonpolar, and that might make the molecule as a whole nonpolar enough to get through that blood-brain barrier and to be active in your cerebrospinal fluid. So if you're treating diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or something like that, neurological disorders, you might consider that in these side chains. But it is, after all, the rigid, stable parts of the molecule that fit into the receptor sites. And so it's important to be able to recognize those. Now, benzene is of course the most stable, or the most famous, I should say, not the most stable, the most famous of the aromatic rings. But it's certainly not the only one. This nitrogen has a lone pair there, and if that lone pair flies around in a p orbital, then you would have parallel p orbitals on every atom in that ring. Not only that, but the number of electrons moving in that is 2, 4, and then with that lone pair, 6. 6 is a Huckel's number, and so that ring in the middle is an aromatic ring. Oops. That ring is an aromatic ring. And so that is rigid and stable too. Not only that, but notice that the pi bonds here are conjugated. So actually that whole thing is a parallel p orbital system. And this is conjugated with that lone pair, with that pi bond. And the nitrogen here has a lone pair that exists in a p orbital that's conjugated with this whole thing. So that entire red part of the molecule is a planar, a flat, rigid system incorporating multiple aromatic rings. And those will fit into an enzyme pocket like a key fits into a lock. Here we have benzene, the most famous of the aromatic rings, but it's not the only one here. The sulfur has 2 lone pairs. If one of those lone pairs exists in a p orbital, py orbital, then you'll have parallel p orbitals all the way around the ring. The other lone pair on that sulfur would exist in an sp2 orbital. And that makes this aromatic because, after all, that would give you 2, 4, and 6 electrons in those p orbitals. 6 is a Huckel's number. So that's another aromatic ring. Not only that, but you'll notice that aside from those aromatic rings, which are very stable, very rigid, those rings are conjugated with this pi bond, so the rigidity is connecting them. And there are lone pairs on this nitrogen that are allylic to that pi bond, so those continue the rigidity. And there are lone pairs on the nitrogen in between, which are allylic, and so those also exist in a p orbital. And so, actually, if you think about it, we have parallel p orbitals on these atoms. We have this lone pair existing in a py orbital. We have p orbitals here from the pi bonds there. And then we have parallel p orbitals here. So we have parallel p orbitals all the way around this ring. Not only that, but the number of electrons in those p orbitals is 2, 4, 6, 8. Well, that doesn't forebode very well. 8 is anti-aromatic, and so you won't have an aromatic ring there. 2, 4, 6, 8. So you don't have an aromatic ring there, but you do have a certain amount of rigidity coming from all the conjugation. Your only aromatic rings are the aromatic rings on the ends. So you have the benzene ring and the sulfur ring on the ends. Otherwise, you do have occasionally parallel p orbitals, but because it would create anti-aromaticity, it's unlikely that they're going to be parallel all the way around that middle ring all the time. All right, next one, Norvasc, used in the treatment of angina and high blood pressure. Well, we've got benzene. It's rigid, so it has a reliable shape that will reliably fit into an enzyme pocket, and it's very stable, so it's not going to react with anything. And that is actually the only aromatic ring in this molecule. You have conjugated pi bonds. The p orbitals here are conjugated with those. This nitrogen has a lone pair, which is allylic to the pi bond, so that's stable, and that's conjugated with that. So you have regions of rigidity in the rest of the molecule, but the only aromatic ring, the only one that's especially stable and especially rigid, is that ring on top. If you look at Nexium, Nexium is a proton pump inhibitor used in treatment of ulcers and acid reflux. And here you've got this benzene aromatic ring, sure, but you also have this aromatic ring on the left. You have parallel p orbitals all the way around a ring with 2, 4, 6 electrons in the p orbitals. 6 is a Huckel's number, and so that's another aromatic ring. Notice that even outside of those aromatic rings, you have a lot of rigidity. You have a lone pair on this nitrogen, so that's allylic to those. You have p orbitals on this nitrogen, which is allylic there. That pi bond is conjugated with the pi bond between the sulfur and the oxygen. And you also have lone pairs on this ether oxygen, one of which can exist in a p orbital and spread out. So notice how much conjugation you can have in these molecules. Now, the highest level of stability and rigidity will be gotten from the aromatic rings. Other bonds that are in between, like this bond here, will rotate if the temperature is high enough, so they're not quite as rigid or stable, but they add a lot of rigidity and stability to the molecule. And as you'll notice, a lot of these biologically active molecules have a lot of rigidity in them because they need to reliably fit into a receptor site. Prevacid, a proton pump inhibitor used in the treatment of ulcers and acid reflux, again. And notice here, both of these two drugs are used in the treatment of acid reflux. And the truth is, looking at the structures of them, they're probably both fitting into the same enzyme pocket, the same receptor site. I mean, look at the similarity. You have the benzene ring over here. You have the same aromatic ring with the nitrogen. You have the same conjugated thing here. You have the lone pairs on the nitrogen that are allylic. you have the sulfur with a double bond to the oxygen that's rigid. Notice how similar these two molecules are. And notice what they've changed. On the ring, okay, fine, they've changed something small. But what they've really changed is stuff coming off of it. And that allows the molecule to either be more or less polar, more or less acidic, more or less nonpolar. But you can see how these similarities in shape, just like keys with similar shape will get you through the same door, these similarities in shape are making the medications perform similar functions. But the two aromatic rings in this, just like before, are only these two, the benzene and the ring with the nitrogen. Next we have Plavix. It's being described as an antiplatelet agent, so it prevents blood clots from forming, and it's used in the treatment of coronary artery disease. We have benzene in there. There's our rigid, stable ring. And also, this sulfur has two lone pairs. If one of them exists in a p or py orbital, then you'll have parallel p orbitals all the way around the ring with 2, 4, 6 electrons in them. 6 is a Huckel's number, and so that is going to be an aromatic ring. And notice you have another rigid part of the molecule. It's not aromatic, but it is rigid. You have a lone pair there. That's allylic to that pi bond. So that part of the molecule is going to be rigid too. And you have another ring that happens not to be aromatic, but it's another ring. It adds a little bit of rigidity there. And so you see this pattern of rigidity and stability appearing in these biologically active molecules. In this one, Ceravent, it's used to treat asthma. You of course have the benzene rings, which are aromatic, and those are the only aromatic rings in the whole molecule. In addition to those, you do have just a tiny bit of rigidity here. This lone pair is allylic to that ring, so one of those can exist in a p orbital and spread out with them there. But yeah, this one has a lot of loose parts in the middle here. So it's interesting. Probably this bends in a certain way, and these two fit together at the same time into the pocket, the enzyme pocket, whatever this fits into. And last we have Zoloft. In Zoloft, we have the two benzene rings, and those are really the only aromatic rings in that compound. And so you can see how these patterns, first of all, aromatic molecules, you can get a sense of how significant they are. These are 8 of the best-selling drugs in the United States, and all of them have at least one aromatic ring in them. And not only that, some of them have a lot of other aromatic rings with heterocycles. And so you can get a sense of how to read molecules based on the portions that are rigid versus the portions that can move around. And also you get a sense of how these rigid, stable aromatic rings are being used to reliably communicate messages in molecules that don't react, don't change as they go from one place